The coffee was cold, and the waitress had stopped refilling it an hour ago. Cade Drummond sat at the corner booth with 5 brothers from the Iron Covenant MC, nursing a headache and a long ride that still had 300 miles to go. They'd been on the road since dawn, heading to a rally in Sacramento, and the Nevada desert stretched before them like a promise of more dust and heat. That's when she walked in. The girl was small, maybe 7, with dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail and a jacket 2 sizes too big. She moved through the diner like she was searching for someone specific, her eyes scanning the booths until they landed on the table of leather vests and worn denim. She stopped, stared, then walked straight toward them. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you the motorcycle people?" Cade looked up from his map. The kid was holding something, a photograph, creased and faded, clutched between small fingers that trembled slightly. The other men at the table exchanged glances. It wasn't every day a child approached them without fear. "Depends on what you need, little one," Cade said, his voice softer than usual. "You lost?" She shook her head. "I need to ask you something important." One of the men, a giant named Rook with a scarred jawline and a neck tattoo that read Brotherhood, leaned forward. "What's your name, kid?" "Sutton," she said. "Sutton Blake." "All right, Sutton Blake. What's so important?" She placed the photograph on the table. It showed a woman with kind eyes and a smile that looked like it came easy. The woman was thin, pale, but the warmth in her expression was unmistakable. "This is my mom," Sutton said. "Her name is Iris. She's in the hospital right now. The doctors say she's going to heaven soon." The table went quiet. "I heard that motorcycle people visit veterans when they die," Sutton continued, her words coming faster now, like she'd rehearsed them. "They ride with them and make sure they're not alone. I heard they do it because it's the right thing to do." Cade nodded slowly. "Yeah, we do that sometimes." "Can you visit my mom when she goes to heaven?" Sutton asked. "She's not a veteran, but she's really nice. She works at the library. She reads to people who can't read anymore. She makes lemon cookies for the neighbors. She never hurt anybody." Rook cleared his throat. Another man, a wiry guy named Flint with graying temples, looked away. "Sweetheart," Cade said carefully, "we don't usually—" "She's scared," Sutton interrupted, and now her voice cracked. "She told me she's scared of being forgotten. She said sometimes people die and nobody remembers them. But if you come visit her, then she'll know people remember. Please, I don't have money, but I can give you my allowance. It's $7. I've been saving it." She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope with coins and a few bills inside. Cade stared at the envelope, then at the photograph, then at the girl whose entire world was collapsing around her. "Put that away," he said quietly. "You're not paying us anything." Sutton's eyes filled with tears. "So you won't do it?" "I didn't say that." Cade looked at the men around the table. They all wore the same expression, a mixture of heartbreak and something else, something that looked like duty. "Where's your mom now?" Cade asked. "Carson Valley Medical Center, room 314. Ding! Cade pulled out his phone and typed something. Then he stood up, towering over the small girl who had just asked 5 strangers to honor her dying mother. "We'll visit her," he said, "when the time comes. I promise you that." Sutton nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Thank you." She turned to leave, but Cade stopped her. "Hey, Sutton, does your mom know you're here?" The girl shook her head. "She thinks I'm at Mrs. Patterson's house, but I had to ask you. I had to make sure." How'd you get here? I walked. It's only 2 miles. Cade exhaled slowly. Flint's gonna give you a ride back. You tell Mrs. Patterson you went for a walk, got it? Don't mention us. Sutton nodded again, then looked up at Cade with an expression that would haunt him for years. Will there be a lot of you? She asked. When you visit, how many do you want? Enough so she hears the engines from heaven. Iris Blake died on a Tuesday morning at 6:47 a.m., 3 weeks after Sutton walked into that diner. Cade got the call from a nurse named Valerie, who had been given his number by Sutton herself. The girl had written it down on a piece of notebook paper and tucked it into her mother's hospital file with a note that read, "These are the people who promised." Cade was in his garage when the phone rang, elbow deep in engine grease and halfway through rebuilding a carburetor. He didn't recognize the number, but something told him to answer. "Is this Cade Drummond?" the voice asked. "Yeah. Who's this?" "My name is Valerie Chen. I'm a nurse at Carson Valley Medical. I'm calling about Iris Blake." Cade set down his wrench. "She's gone. This morning. It was peaceful. She wasn't in pain." "Where's the kid?" "Sutton's with her father. They're making arrangements now. The funeral is set for Saturday at noon, Meadowbrook Cemetery, just outside town." "Got it. Thanks for letting me know." There was a pause on the other end. "Mr. Drummond, Sutton told me what you promised her. She told me you and your friends were going to visit her mom. I just wanted to say, that means everything to her, to all of us who knew Iris." "We'll be there," Cade said. He hung up and stared at the phone for a long moment. Then he opened his contacts and started making calls. The first was to Rook, then Flint, then the chapter president, a man named Vaughan, who'd been riding for 40 years and had buried more brothers than he could count. "We made a promise to a kid," Cade explained. "Her mom just passed. Funeral's Saturday. We need to show up." Vaughan didn't hesitate. "How many riders you want?" "Enough so she hears the engines from heaven." "I'll make some calls." By Wednesday night, the word had spread through 3 chapters of the Iron Covenant MC. By Thursday morning, it had reached allied clubs across Nevada, California, and Arizona. By Friday afternoon, Cade's phone was flooded with messages from riders he'd never met. Men and women from clubs with names like Desert Kings, Sierra Nomads, and Thunder Road Veterans. They all wanted to know the same thing. "What time do we ride?" Cade sent out a single group message with the details. Meadowbrook Cemetery, Saturday, 11:30 a.m., full colors, respectful formation. "This is for a 7-year-old girl who asked us to honor her mother. Do not disappoint her." The response was immediate. Dozens of confirmations, then hundreds. By Friday night, Cade realized they had a problem. There were too many of them. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and a cold wind that cut through the desert like a blade. Cade stood in the parking lot of a truck stop 15 miles outside Carson Valley, watching as motorcycles poured in from every direction. He'd expected maybe 50 riders, maybe 70. There were over 400. They came in waves, clusters of leather and chrome that rolled into the lot with engines rumbling like distant thunder. Some wore patches from clubs Cade recognized. Others were independents, solo riders who'd heard about the promise and decided to show up anyway. There were veterans on old Harleys, young riders on sport bikes, women in full gear who'd driven through the night from as far as Oregon. Rook pulled up beside Cade and cut his engine. "Holy hell." "Yeah," Cade said quietly. A man in his 60s dismounted from a Road King and walked over. His vest read, Desert King's MC, founding member. His name was Harlan, and his face looked like it had been carved from stone. "You Drummond?" he asked. "That's me." "Heard about the kid. Heard about the promise. We're here to honor it." "Appreciate it." Harlan nodded. "What's the plan?" Cade looked around at the sea of motorcycles. "We ride in formation, 2 columns, slow and respectful. No revving, no showboating. This isn't a rally, it's a funeral." "Understood." Another rider approached, a woman with silver hair and a vest that read Sierra Nomads. Her name was Corinne, and she'd been riding for 30 years. "We brought flowers," she said, gesturing to a truck that had just pulled in. "Enough for every bike, white roses. Figured the girl would like that." Cade felt something tighten in his chest. That's perfect, thank you." By 11:15 the procession was ready. 412 motorcycles lined up in perfect formation, stretching nearly a mile down the highway. Each rider carried a white rose attached to their handlebars. The sound of idling engines filled the air like a prayer. Cade mounted his bike and checked his watch. 15 minutes until the funeral started. He thought about Sutton, about the photograph she'd placed on the table, about the promise he'd made to a girl who'd already lost everything. Then he kicked his engine to life and led the convoy toward Meadowbrook Cemetery. "And now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact hour you heard this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel and at what moments they reach you." Sutton Blake stood beside her father at the graveside, staring at the casket that held her mother. The service had been small. A handful of relatives, a few co-workers from the library, and Mrs. Patterson from next door. The pastor had spoken about grace and mercy, and how Iris was in a better place now. Sutton didn't hear most of it. She kept looking toward the cemetery entrance, hoping to see motorcycles. Her father, Garrett Blake, was a quiet man who worked construction and hadn't smiled since his wife got sick. He stood with one hand on Sutton's shoulder, his jaw tight, his eyes red from crying in private. He didn't know about the promise. Sutton hadn't told him. She was afraid he'd say the bikers weren't coming, that she'd been foolish to believe strangers would keep their word. The pastor finished his prayer. People began to disperse. The cemetery workers waited nearby with shovels. And then Sutton heard it. At first, it was just a low rumble in the distance, like thunder approaching from the west. But it grew louder, deeper, more deliberate. Everyone turned toward the sound. Garrett frowned. "What the hell is that?" Then they appeared. 400 motorcycles rolled through the cemetery gates in perfect formation, moving slowly along the narrow road that wound between the graves. The sound was overwhelming, not loud or aggressive, but powerful, reverent, like the earth itself was paying respects. Sutton's mouth fell open. The motorcycles came to a stop in a massive semicircle around the gravesite, their engines idling in unison. The riders dismounted in silence, each one carrying a white rose. They formed lines, quiet, respectful, unmoving. Cade Drummond stepped forward, removing his sunglasses. He walked directly to Sutton and knelt down so they were eye level. "We promised we'd visit your mom," he said quietly. "We're here." Sutton's eyes filled with tears. "There's so many of you." "Your mom deserved this," Cade said. "She deserved to be remembered." He handed her a white rose, then stood and addressed the crowd of mourners who were staring in shock. "My name is Cade Drummond," he said, his voice carrying across the cemetery. These riders and I are here because a brave little girl asked us to honor her mother. Iris Blake was a librarian, a neighbor, a friend, and a mother. She spent her life helping others. She made the world better just by being in it. And we wanted her to know, we wanted all of you to know, that she will not be forgotten. He turned to the other riders. One by one, they stepped forward and placed their white roses on the casket until it was covered in a blanket of flowers. The silence was broken only by the sound of engines and the wind through the trees. Garrett Blake stood frozen, tears streaming down his face. He looked at his daughter, then at the hundreds of strangers who had shown up for a woman they'd never met. "Who are these people?" he whispered. "They're Mom's angels," Sutton said. Someone at the funeral recorded the scene on their phone. It was grainy footage, shaky and poorly framed, but it captured everything that mattered. The sound of the engines, the sea of roses, Sutton's face as she watched 400 strangers honor her mother. The video was uploaded to Facebook that night with a simple caption, "A little girl asked bikers to visit her mom in heaven. This is what they did." By Monday morning, it had 10 million views. By Tuesday, it was on every major news network. The story spread like wildfire. News anchors called it the most beautiful tribute of the year. Social media exploded with messages of support. Strangers from around the world left comments saying they'd cried watching the video. Some said it had restored their faith in humanity. Cade's phone rang non-stop. Reporters wanted interviews. Morning shows wanted him to appear. A producer from Los Angeles called, asking if he'd be interested in a documentary. He ignored most of it. But one call stood out. It was from a woman named Eleanor Winters, a producer for a non-profit that helped children who'd lost parents to terminal illness. She'd seen the video and wanted to know if the Iron Covenant would be willing to do something similar for other families. "What you did for Iris Blake was extraordinary," Eleanor said. "But there are thousands of kids out there who are going through the same thing. Kids who feel invisible. Kids who think nobody cares." Cade sat in his garage, staring at the wall where he'd hung a photograph of Sutton and her mother. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking if you'd be willing to turn this into something bigger. A network of riders who show up for families who have nobody else, who make sure that when someone dies, they're not forgotten." Cade was quiet for a long moment. "That's a hell of a commitment. I know, but I think you've already made it." He thought about Sutton, about the envelope of $7 she'd tried to give him, about the look on her face when 400 motorcycles rolled into the cemetery. "Let me talk to my brothers," Cade said. "I'll get back to you." That night, he called a church meeting, a formal gathering of the Iron Covenant's leadership. Vaughan, Rook, Flint, and a dozen other senior members sat around a table in the clubhouse, listening as Cade explained Elena's proposal. "It's a big ask," Cade said. "We'd be committing to showing up for strangers, for families we don't know, for people who have nothing to offer us." "Sounds like what we already did," Rook said. "Yeah, but this would be regular, organized. We'd be making it part of who we are." Vaughan leaned back in his chair. "I've been riding for 40 years. I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of. But what we did for Iris Blake, that's the first time in a long time I felt like I was doing something that mattered." The others nodded. "I vote we do it," Vaughan said. "We make this our mission. We show up for the forgotten. We honor the dead. We give kids like Sutton something to hold on to." The vote was unanimous. 1 year after Iris Blake's funeral, Cade returned to Meadowbrook Cemetery with 500 motorcycles behind him. It had become an annual tradition, the memorial ride, and it had grown beyond anything he'd imagined. Sutton was there, now 8 years old, standing beside her father and holding a bouquet of white roses. She'd been invited to lead the procession, riding on the back of Cade's bike as they entered the cemetery, but this time they weren't just honoring Iris. They were honoring 63 other people, mothers, fathers, veterans, children, who had died in the past year and whose families had reached out to the Iron Covenant for help. Each grave received a white rose, each name was read aloud, each life was remembered. The event was covered by national media. CNN ran a segment called "The Bikers Who Won't Let You Die Alone." The Today Show interviewed Cade and Sutton together, and when the host asked Sutton what her mother would think, the girl said she'd be proud. She always said the best thing you can do is make someone feel seen. The segment ended with footage of the memorial ride, hundreds of motorcycles winding through the cemetery, their engines a chorus of respect and remembrance. After the broadcast, donations poured in. People from around the country sent money to help fund the rides. Others volunteered to organize similar events in their own states. Within 6 months, the memorial ride had chapters in 37 states. It became something bigger than anyone expected, a movement, a community, a way for strangers to honor strangers, for the living to remember the dead, and for children like Sutton to know that they were not alone. If this story has moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to see it. These stories matter because you make them matter. By the time Sutton Blake turned 16, the memorial ride had become a national institution. There were chapters in all 50 states, and more than 10,000 riders participated annually. The non-profit that Elena Winters had founded, the Remembrance Project, had helped over 2,000 families, providing free funeral services, grief counseling, and memorial rides for those who couldn't afford traditional burials. Sutton had become the unofficial ambassador of the movement. She spoke at events, shared her story, and helped organize rides in her mother's name. She'd grown into a poised young woman with her mother's kindness and her father's quiet strength. But she never forgot the promise that started it all. Every year, on the anniversary of her mother's death, Sutton returned to Meadowbrook Cemetery with Cade and the Iron Covenant. They would stand at Iris's grave, place fresh roses, and remember the woman who'd made lemon cookies and read to strangers at the library. This particular year, 9 years after Iris's passing, Sutton had something special planned. She'd written a letter, not to her mother, but to every rider who had shown up that first day. The letter was printed and distributed to all 10,000 participants of the memorial ride. It was read aloud at ceremonies across the country, and it said this: "When I was 7 years old, I asked a group of strangers to visit my mom in heaven. I didn't know if they would come. I didn't know if they even cared, but they did. And they didn't just come once. They kept coming. They kept showing up, not just for my mom, but for thousands of others who deserve to be remembered. You taught me that grief doesn't have to be lonely, that kindness doesn't have to be complicated, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show up for someone who can't show up for themselves. My mom used to say that the measure of a life isn't in how famous you become or how much money you make. It's in how many people remember your name when you're gone. Thanks to all of you, my mom's name will never be forgotten, and neither will the names of everyone you've honored since. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. You gave me my faith back. You gave me hope, and you gave my mom something she was afraid she'd never have: proof that she mattered. With love and gratitude, Sutton Blake. Garrett Blake had never been good with emotions. He'd spent most of his life working with his hands, building houses, fixing roofs, laying foundations. Words had always felt clumsy in his mouth, insufficient for what he felt inside. After Iris died, he'd become even quieter, channeling his grief into 16-hour workdays and silent nights, where he'd sit in the garage, staring at tools he couldn't bring himself to use. But on the 10th anniversary of Iris's death, something shifted. He woke up that morning and realized he'd been carrying a weight he'd never acknowledged, a debt he'd never properly paid. He called Cade Drummond and asked if they could meet. "I want to do something," Garrett said over the phone, "for you and the others. Something I should have done a long time ago." Cade was quiet for a moment. "You don't owe us anything, Garrett." "Yeah, I do, and I need to say it out loud." 2 weeks later, Garrett arranged a private gathering at the original diner where Sutton had first approached the bikers. It was a Saturday afternoon, and he'd rented out the entire place. The owner, a woman named Darlene, who'd been working there for 30 years, remembered that day vividly and refused to charge him. "What those men did for your little girl," Darlene said, her eyes watering, "that was the most beautiful thing I ever saw in this place. You don't pay for something like that." The guests arrived in waves. Cade, Rook, and Flint came first, their motorcycles gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Then came Vaughn, the chapter president, now in his 70s, but still riding. Elena Winters drove in from Los Angeles. Valerie Chen, the nurse who'd made that first phone call, flew in from Portland, where she now ran a hospice program. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who'd watched Sutton that fateful day, arrived with a homemade pie and tears already forming in her eyes. And Sutton, now 17, poised and strong in ways that broke Garrett's heart because she reminded him so much of Iris, walked in carrying a small wooden box. They all gathered in the same corner booth where it had started. The booth had been marked with a small brass plaque that read, "Where promises are made and kept, in memory of Iris Blake." Garrett stood at the head of the table, his calloused hands gripping the back of a chair. He'd rehearsed this speech a dozen times, but now that everyone was here, the words felt inadequate again. "I'm not good at speeches," he began, his voice rough. "Never have been. Iris was the one who knew how to say things right. She could take something complicated and make it simple, make it beautiful." He looked at Sutton, who smiled encouragingly. "When she got sick," Garrett continued, "I didn't know what to do. I worked more hours, took on extra shifts, convinced myself that if I just earned enough money I could fix it. But you can't fix cancer with overtime, and I couldn't give Sutton what she needed. I couldn't give her hope." His voice cracked. Rook shifted uncomfortably. Flint looked away. "The day Sutton walked into this diner and asked you to visit her mother, I didn't know about it. She kept it a secret because she thought I'd tell her it was foolish, that strangers don't keep promises, that the world doesn't work that way." Garrett looked directly at Cade. "But you proved her right. You proved me wrong. You could have ignored my daughter. You could have told her no, or patted her on the head and sent her away. But you didn't. You made a promise to a scared little girl, and you kept it." He pulled out a weathered envelope, the same one Sutton had tried to give Cade 10 years ago. "This is $7, the money Sutton tried to pay you with. She asked me to return it today. She said you never let her pay you, but she wanted you to have it anyway, as a reminder." Cade reached for the envelope, his expression unreadable. "Open it," Sutton said softly. Inside were the crumpled bills and coins. carefully preserved. But there was also a photograph, the same one Sutton had placed on the table 10 years ago. Iris's smiling face, forever frozen in time. And beneath it, a note in Sutton's handwriting. To Cade and all the riders who kept their promise, thank you for teaching me that honor is real, that people can be good, that my mother's life mattered. This money represents the only thing I had to give you back then. Now I'm giving you something more valuable, my word that I'll spend my life doing what you did for us. I'll show up. I'll keep promises. I'll make sure nobody is forgotten. Sutton Blake. Cade stared at the note for a long moment. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. Your daughter doesn't need to prove anything, he said to Garrett. She already changed the world just by having the courage to ask. Valerie Chen spoke up, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. I was working the overnight shift when Iris passed. She'd been unconscious for hours, but right before the end she opened her eyes. She looked at Sutton and said, "The engines. I hear the engines." We thought she was hallucinating, but she smiled, and then she was gone. She paused. I think she knew. Somehow she knew you were coming, Eleanor Winters added. What started as a promise to one little girl has become a movement that's touched hundreds of thousands of lives. The Remembrance Project has organized over 15,000 memorial rides in the past decade. We've helped families who had nothing. We've given dignity to people society forgot. And it all started here, in this booth, with a child who refused to let her mother be forgotten. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been quietly crying, finally spoke. Iris used to tell me that the world was full of small kindnesses that nobody notices. She said that's what held everything together. Not grand gestures, but little acts of love that people do when nobody's watching. What you did for her wasn't small, it was monumental, but it started with a small choice to say yes. Garrett cleared his throat. I've never been religious, but if there is a heaven, I know Iris is up there watching this, and I know she's proud, not just of Sutton, but of all of you. You gave our family something precious. You gave us faith. Cade stood and extended his hand to Garrett. Your daughter saved us too. She reminded us why we ride, why we wear these patches. It's not about rebellion or freedom. It's about standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. The two men shook hands, and then Garrett pulled Cade into a brief, hard embrace. Thank you, Garrett whispered, for giving me my daughter back. As the gathering ended and people began to leave, Sutton pulled Cade aside in the parking lot. The sun was setting, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple. There's something I need to tell you, she said. I got accepted to a graduate program in social work. I'm going to specialize in grief counseling for children who've lost parents. That's incredible, Sutton. And I'm starting a new initiative with the Remembrance Project. We're expanding internationally. Canada, the UK, Australia, Japan. We're going to teach other communities how to create their own memorial rides, how to show up for the forgotten. Cade nodded. That sounds right. I want you on the board of directors. I want your voice in how this grows. Will you do it? Cade looked at this young woman who'd once been a terrified child with a photograph and $7. She'd grown into someone remarkable, someone who'd taken grief and transformed it into purpose. Yeah, he said. I'm in. Sutton hugged him tightly. You kept your promise. Now I'm going to keep mine. 15 years after Iris Blake's death, the world had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The memorial ride had grown from a single ceremony into a global movement with chapters in 63 countries. The Remembrance Project had helped over 50,000 families, providing memorial services, grief counseling, and community support for people who'd been forgotten by society. And Sutton Blake, now 22, with her mother's compassionate eyes and her father's unwavering determination, stood at the center of it all. It was graduation day at the University of Nevada. Sutton walked across the stage to receive her master's degree in social work, specializing in pediatric grief counseling. The auditorium was packed with family, friends, and faculty. But in the back row, sitting in their full colors and leather vests, were 23 members of the Iron Covenant MC, including Cade Drummond. When Sutton's name was called, they stood as one and applauded. The sound echoed through the auditorium, and several people turned to look at the bikers with confusion, but anyone who knew Sutton's story understood immediately. These weren't strangers. They were family. After the ceremony, Sutton found Cade in the parking lot. He was leaning against his motorcycle, the same one he'd ridden that first day to the cemetery, looking older now, with silver threading through his beard and deeper lines around his eyes. But his presence was still the same, solid, dependable, unshakable. "You came," Sutton said, walking up to him. "Of course we did. We made a promise 15 years ago to show up. That promise doesn't have an expiration date." Sutton smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep gratitude. "I have something for you." She handed him a bound document, a thesis she'd written for her graduate program, titled From Grief to Grace: How Community-Based Memorial Practices Transform Childhood Bereavement. "It's about us," she said, "about what you and the riders did, about how a single act of kindness created ripples that changed thousands of lives." Cade flipped through the pages, seeing charts, interviews, and case studies. "This is impressive. It's been cited in 3 academic journals already. Social workers and grief counselors across the country are using the Memorial Ride model as a template for their own communities. You're literally being taught in universities now." Cade laughed, a rare, genuine sound. "Never thought I'd see the day when bikers were being taught in classrooms. You're not just bikers. You're proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things if they just choose to show up." Garrett Blake approached, looking healthier than he had in years. He'd remarried a kind woman named Claire who'd lost her own husband to cancer and had started a non-profit that built affordable housing for families in crisis. Grief had nearly destroyed him, but he'd found a way to transform it into purpose. "Proud of you, kid," Garrett said, hugging his daughter. "Thanks, Dad." Rook and Flint walked over, both grinning. Rook was now the chapter president after Vaughan had retired, and Flint ran a motorcycle repair shop that trained at-risk youth. "So what's next for you?" Rook asked Sutton. "I got a job offer," she said. "The Remembrance Project wants me to be their international director. I'd be traveling around the world, helping communities set up their own memorial programs, teaching people how to honor the dead and support the grieving." "That's a big job," Flint said. "I know, but I think it's what I'm supposed to do. My mom spent her life making people feel seen. I want to do the same thing, just on a bigger scale." Cade pulled out his phone and showed her something. "Did you see this?" It was a news article from the BBC, "The Memorial Ride Phenomenon: How an American Biker's Promise to a Grieving Child Sparked a Global Movement." The article featured interviews with families from 12 different countries who'd been helped by Remembrance Project chapters. There were photographs of memorial rides in London, Tokyo, Sydney, Sao Paulo and Nairobi. Each one featured motorcycles, flowers and people standing together to honor the forgotten. "You did this," Cade said to Sutton. "You made this happen." "We did this," she corrected. "It started with you saying yes." As the sun began to set over the campus, casting long shadows across the parking lot, Sutton turned to Cade with a serious expression. "I need to ask you something," she said. "The Remembrance Project is planning something huge for next year, the 20th anniversary of my mum's death. We want to organize the largest memorial ride in history. We're talking about coordinated rides. In every country we have chapters, tens of thousands of motorcycles all riding at the same time, honoring people who died alone or forgotten." She paused. "I want you to lead it. I want you to be the face of this movement. Will you do it?" Cade was quiet for a long moment, looking at the young woman who'd once been a scared child with a photograph. She'd grown into someone who'd taken a promise and turned it into a legacy. Someone who'd proven that grief didn't have to destroy you. It could transform you. "On one condition," Cade finally said. "What's that?" "You ride with me, front and center, because this isn't my legacy. It's yours, and it's your mother's." Sutton's eyes filled with tears. "Deal." They shook hands, sealing a new promise. One that would bring together riders from 70 countries, honor 20,000 names, and remind the world that every life matters, that nobody should die alone, that some promises echo through generations. Epilogue. 2 years later, on a clear spring morning, Sutton Blake stood at her mother's grave in Meadowbrook Cemetery. She was 24 now, and the executive director of the Remembrance Project. The organization had grown beyond anything she'd imagined, with chapters in 91 countries and a staff of over 300 people dedicated to honoring the forgotten. But today wasn't about statistics or success. Today was personal. She knelt down and placed fresh white roses on the grave. The headstone read, "Iris Marie Blake, beloved mother, librarian. Friend, she made everyone feel seen." Behind Sutton, stretching as far as the eye could see, were motorcycles, 60,000 of them, representing the largest coordinated memorial ride in human history. They'd come from every continent, riding through cities and towns, each one carrying a name of someone who died without recognition, each one proving that the world hadn't forgotten. Cade stood beside her, now in his 60s, but still riding strong. Garrett was there too, along with Claire and their 2 young children, Sutton's half-siblings, who'd been named Iris and Hope. "I wish she could see this," Sutton said softly. "She can," Cade replied. "I believe that." The engines started simultaneously, a rumble that shook the earth and echoed across the valley. It wasn't loud or aggressive, it was reverent, a prayer made of thunder and chrome. Sutton closed her eyes and listened. For a moment she was 7 years old again, standing in a roadside diner, asking strangers to visit her mother in heaven. She could still feel the fear and hope that had driven her that day, the desperate need to make sure her mother mattered. And now, 15 years later, 60,000 people had shown up to prove that she did. "Thank you," Sutton whispered to the riders, to her mother, to the universe that had somehow brought them all together. "Thank you for keeping your promise." The engines roared louder, a chorus of affirmation, of love, of remembrance. And somewhere, in whatever place exists beyond this world, Iris Blake smiled. Because her daughter had learned the most important lesson, that the greatest act of love is to make sure nobody is forgotten, that some promises last forever, and that kindness, once planted, grows into forests that shelter generations. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. These stories exist because people like you believe in them. Until next time, ride safe, stay kind, and remember, the world changes when ordinary people decide to keep extraordinary promises.